Welcome back to the Millennium Live Podcast, where today's most innovative minds come together to share some bold strategies, ideas, and actionable insights for transforming the digital enterprise. And we're diving into what's going to be a great episode ahead of our transformational CMO assembly by the Millennium Alliance. And it's a channel that's often underestimated, but consistently outperforms, and that's the real ROI of email marketing. And our guests are two industry powerhouses that I'm so happy to have join our podcast. They have their own podcast as well, which we'll get into. But from our awesome partner at Validity, we have Guy Hansen. He is the Vice President of Customer Engagement. Thank you so much, Guy, for taking the time out to join us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us.
Of course. And secondly, we have Danielle Gallant. She is the Senior Email Strategist over at Validity. Thank you, Danielle, for coming on board today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Amazing. And together, they're going to unpack one of the most pressing questions in digital marketing today, and that's how to get your C-level executives to truly understand and be on board and investing in the value of email. So breaking down the tools and strategies that marketers can use to make emails impact that crystal clear and a revenue contribution, brand awareness, the KPIs that move the needle. And, of course, can't have a Millennium Live podcast without talking about how AI is reshaping the future of email performance. So thank you again, both, for joining, and want to dive into it right away. And speaking of the metrics, that we can get the C-level on board with this. So, Guy, I think I'll start with you. So what are the metrics that need to be used to get C-level interest and to get that buy-in to email marketing?
It's a great question. And I think generally when we are speaking with senior level decision makers, it normally comes down to email's revenue contribution. And I think a very useful metric for us and helpful if our customers know it is revenue per email. On average, for every marketing email that you send, how much revenue is it likely to generate for your business? And, a good benchmark could probably be anywhere between sort of 5 cents and 10 cents a message, which are good numbers. And, that's why email is so revenue effective. So that's probably the top one. I think in addition to that, common questions that we answer when it comes to metrics are things like what kind of return on investment is going to be generated, possibly what kind of economic value is going to be added to the business by making the investment, what's the payback period going to be, and perhaps even stuff like what's the increase in shareholder value, etc. I think there's also softer metrics, they're a little bit harder to quantify, but they're important. Things like, is it going to move the needle in terms of brand awareness, customer retention and loyalty and customer engagement. So all of those are important too. And, Danielle and I often joke about it, but most senior decision makers are fixated on list size and list growth as well. So, will this investment help them grow their marketing audience? And, sometimes we try to manage that one, sometimes it's the quality rather than the quantity, but it always crops up. So we've got to deal with it.
Yes, of course. And that's a great way to start, Guy. And I want to talk a little bit about it in addition to metrics. Danielle, is there any different language that marketers perhaps need to use to better educate the C-suite about the value that email is adding to their business?
Yeah, I definitely don't find it super successful when the marketers I work with talk about DMARC reporting or something super technical that just might not be a part of the day-to-day language for C-levels. But what I find really helpful is some form of standardization, really. I think it becomes there's so much going on with email always, right? And it's always changing, and there are new journeys and new flows, and how do we measure anything? And so finding some sort of standardization that can be shared in the same format repeatedly with C-levels is really, really helpful. One of the clients I work with, we just developed basically an email report card. So it is the same data that we're reporting on monthly so that it can be tracked. And it sounds pretty basic, but it also helps us slip in those changes that may happen over month to explain why there might have been changes in performance. So really, I would just go to standardization. But Guy, you were also telling me about some thoughts you had about communicating C-level too.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, what we're just picking up in terms of metrics. And I think, the C-level uses its own language. And I think, just being able to sort of position, what we might more commonly think about in terms of open rates and click rates, in terms of what does it mean in terms of conversion? What does it mean in terms of revenue? What's it going to add to your business in terms of value? And connecting those dots from email metrics to revenue metrics is probably why people like you and me have a job, Danielle.
That's awesome. As I mentioned in the intro, when speaking of email ROI, we often hear of the 36 to 1 or 42 to 1 or even 90 to 1. I know you guys had a great guest, Chad White,
That's right.
on your awesome Email After Hours podcast, which we'll save that for later to our audience to get them over to listen. But these numbers almost sound too good to be true. So, Guy, are these realistic numbers?
I've got to be honest and say that sometimes even we sort of scratch our heads a little bit when we see them. I mean, it's a great news story, but as you say, is it too good to be true? I'm based in the UK. I've done quite a lot of work with the Data and Marketing Association over the years. We produce reports based on consumer input, etc. And, we have asked that question of consumers and marketers in the past and actually come up with some fairly similar numbers. So, it stacks up from that point of view. I do suspect that when marketers are asked this question, they're not necessarily thinking about total cost of ownership. I think they're probably thinking about what are they paying to their email service provider and what's their staffing costs. But maybe they're sort of forgetting some of the secondary costs, which might be the costs of operating your website to drive acquisition, sort of in-store promotions to get new signups, working with third-party businesses like ours, to sort of assist with, secondary functions like deliverability and optimization. So I think maybe that's part of it. But you know what? I mean, even if the real answer is like 10 to 1 or 15 to 1, that's still really healthy. I think that the 36 to 1 that you quoted came out of a recent report that we published. And I think one thing that stood out to me was out of 1,800 respondents, not a single one said email generated a negative ROI. So, I think in principle, the number's about right. Maybe a little bit higher than it should be, but the story is correct, that's for sure.
Yeah. And then speaking to a more numbers here, but it's kind of unbelievable that 1 in 5 email marketers don't know what their email ROI is, which is mind-boggling to me. Danielle, how should marketers go by quantifying this metric so they can really justify the effectiveness of their programs and secure the ongoing investment into email?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I feel for the marketers. Attribution can be hard, especially because there are so many different business types. Certain businesses, especially B2B, there can be really lengthy sales cycles. So it can just be really hard to tie it down. So I get it. But really finding a starting point and working out from there. So, for example, ROI per email type, per segment. So like are certain segments performing out or outperforming others? But I think one of the things that kind of gets missed as a part of this question is the goal. So is the goal just to calculate ROI? Is that it? Like increasing sales or revenue? Because email serves so many other functions that I'm sure we're going to talk about later, but raising brand awareness, driving website traffic, so web visits, if that's something that they want to start measuring, lead nurturing. So just pick a certain thing, pick one element, whether it's a certain segment or defining your goal, and then attributing revenue to that particular element.
Yeah, it's often said that if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You
Peter
know,
Drucker, I think.
so which KPIs are most important when it comes to measuring email effectiveness? And Guy, are there any new metrics that email marketers should start using or should be aware of?
So we already talked about the importance of revenue per email. And I mean, that's not a new metric, but it's almost echoed in that sort of, 20% of marketers don't know what their ROI is. That stacks up with, probably the number of times I have asked an email sender if they know the value of that metric, and they've said, no, we don't. And, you really want to find out, because how are you going to go and secure more investment for your program or justify your job if you don't know what that number is? And I think another favorite of mine is subscriber lifetime value. Effectively, what is the owner of each email address on your list likely to spend with your company over the time that they're on that list, typically 2 or 3 years? And probably a good benchmark is somewhere between $30 and $50. And that helps to make good decisions as well, because, if you're thinking about cost per acquisition, if you know that your lifetime value is $30 or $50 and the cost of getting a new address onto your list is $60, you're running your program at a loss. So there's that to consider. And I think it also informs metrics like list churn, and these are the unsexy metrics. People don't get excited about bounce rates and complaint rates in the same way that they get excited about clicks and conversions. That's the reality.
Speak for yourself, Guy. Speak for yourself.
Yeah, but we're three geeks in the room here. But the point I'm making is that even a good email program, every time it does a send, by the time you add up those hard bounces, those complaints, those opt-outs, even a good program is probably averaging 0.5% a send. And if they're doing 2 sends a week and so 100 sends a year, that's half their list they're churning. And then when you sort of frame it in terms of, right, and every time you lose one of those subscribers, that's $30 to $50 of future revenue that's just walked out the door. It kind of focuses your mind in saying, you know what, if we could reduce that list churn by 1/10, what's it going to be worth in terms of future value to our program? So that's another big one for me. Goes without saying that, email engagement metrics, clicks and conversions are important. I think just bear in mind that some clicks are more important than others. And it's amazing how senders sometimes forget that. Yeah, you absolutely want everyone to click on that main call to action in the email body. Is that click through to view the web hosted version of the email as valuable? No, it's not. So make sure that you're looking at them in isolation. And I think finally, bear in mind that there's some engagement metrics which exist but are a lot harder to monitor. But certainly the mailbox providers like Microsoft and Yahoo and Gmail can see them. Things like what percentage of the emails were accidentally delivered to spam, but the recipient really wanted it, and they go to the time and trouble of taking that email out of spam and putting it in their inbox. That's a really strong signal that that's a good email. And so, the Microsofts and Gmails of the world like that. Similarly, emails that get organically forwarded or generate a reply, good, strong signals. And, even if they're harder to measure, email marketers can still be intentional about trying to encourage those behaviors.
Yeah. And, Danielle, I know you had a couple of comments there already, but, I think when you look at it, the KPIs from a financial standpoint, it's like, what is the overall value in terms of dollar that, that we should be looking at email marketing? But I think that the value also comes in terms of impact. And as you already alluded to, that brand awareness, what are the secondary factors too that plays a role, in the overall email value?
Yeah, I mean, well, just to your point, brand awareness is one of them. Like people are used to getting emails, right? So it's a very accepted channel for marketing. We're getting emails and promotions from brands every day, and we expect them. But brand impressions, like so many different brands and senders can literally implement their logo for a very low cost or no cost and get their logo out to whatever their list size might be every day, every week. So even a logo familiarity, a brand familiarity is a major win when it comes to the email channel, and certainly low cost compared to other channels, but relationship building as well. The best email programs do not aim just to sell. They aim to introduce themselves, to reiterate their value, reiterate their purpose, indicate how they're going to improve, the day to day for an individual that's subscribed to them, reiterating what they do for the environment. There, there are lots of opportunities that brands can take to really talk about themselves in a way that people are actually going to listen to when it comes through email. And it's subtle because, like I said, people do expect it. But I think it's also important to remember that email doesn't actually, it is not just for sales. The channel also serves to send service emails, transactional messages, critical updates. I go back to think about like the COVID era when it was really the only way to communicate with mass audiences at a relatively low budget from a marketing perspective. So it absolutely does serve to just as a communication channel as well, between brands and subscribers, and can help maintain and grow relationships that way.
Exactly. That great point, Danielle. And I think a lot of those outside marketing think that if it's they think email marketing, they think lead conversion, and what are the numbers there? But there are so many other factors that play a role. And curious as a little follow up, the other is there other channels like mobile and social, well, where email helps to amplify those?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think when it's done best, like some channels lend themselves better to specific messaging than others. And so when they're married very well, that's when they can amplify kind of one another. And maybe this is my bias, but my favorite examples of these are like skincare or makeup brands, where each channel is used really, really effectively. I want to give a shout out to one brand in particular called The Ordinary, which does this so well. They leverage social media to create a visual impact, to prompt engagement or web signups or email signups that they can then use to grow the list and start promoting through the email channel. So I think it's always best when they work together, but certainly they can amplify one another.
Yeah, and I was on a podcast earlier last week, a marketing podcast, and they were talking about how AI is a tool now for productivity and creativity, less of a replacement, but rather an enhancement. And so I love talking about how AI is transforming this space and transforming marketing in a way where it's only helping marketers. So, Guy, are there any new AI tools that email marketers should be using to better understand email performance?
Thousands of them. But I think I think relative to today's conversation and sort of moving the needle on email ROI, it's probably you talked about creativity and productivity. I think the focus is probably on productivity, and I think where we are seeing AI already used a lot in the world of email marketing is to automate, especially some of those lower level functions, copywriting, creative, subject line generation, sourcing images, that kind of stuff. And of course, it means that the time to complete all of those jobs becomes a lot shorter. It's freeing up resource to do more interesting and valuable stuff within the marketing team. So that's really starting to move the needle, in terms of taking some of the cost out of producing, effective, high performance email marketing campaigns. And I think one really great example that we've come across recently, it's always been considered an email best practice to not use a no reply address. Make it clear to your subscribers that it's a two-way conversation and they can, send emails back to you and ask questions and provide feedback. And of course, the big problem for email marketers is it means that somebody's got to be available to respond to all of that inbound traffic. And so now we're actually starting to see very clever use of AI agents to perform that role and basically receive those sort of inbound inquiries and, basically provide the right answers, the right guidance and feedback, point them down the next step of that conversion funnel. And it also means they look great to the big mailbox providers. Recently Microsoft launched some new sender guidelines for Outlook and Hotmail. And one of them was we would really like to see senders using reply at addresses. So, harnessing AI to actually do, valuable processing of those replies just feels like a very smart implementation of AI as part of email marketing.
Yeah, right. And I guess a better question for me to ask is how marketers can really filter all the different solutions and AI tools that are now out there. As you mentioned, there are already thousands and so many more to come.
That's right. I mean, I went to a dinner last night and it was the topic of conversation. And there was a lady that worked for a smaller brand and she actually stuck up her hand a little bit plaintively at one stage of the conversation and said, "You know what my biggest problem with AI is?" And one of the more sort of tenured people said, "What?" She says, "I literally don't even know where to start. Where do I start? Help me find out where to start." And then the conversation carried on for another hour as we answered that question.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest question that there is. Where do they start?
100%.
So, we've talked a lot about emails revenue effectiveness, Danielle, but there's got to be some pain points that you see on a daily basis, interacting with customers and um, just threats in the current landscape, uh, or just over the horizon that may diminish the value of email effectiveness. So what have you seen uh, in the industry that perhaps are pain points to email marketing?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't let a whole email podcast go by without talking about deliverability. If your emails are not going to or being delivered to subscriber inboxes, which remember, this is not the delivered rate that you will see with your ESPs, this is the deliverability rate. So your inbox placement, your messages are just going to fall flat because nobody is seeing them. So if a sender has a poor reputation or has failed to implement best practices or is trying to take shortcuts, it's all for nothing because those messages are simply not going to be seen. There's not going to be any eyes on them. So deliverability, reputation, this is a major challenge, especially as mailbox providers, all the major players, Yahoo, Gmail, Microsoft, continue to implement more increasingly strict requirements across the board. So making sure that they're all on like that a sender and a brand is on top of their deliverability is pivotal to the success of generating revenue from any campaign. But also competition for eye share. I know it's like we're recording this, not during peak holiday season, but it is almost a joke when we look at just how the volume trend increases starting in like the end of October and then going really all the way through to the rest of the year. Your subject lines, your logo impressions, or BIMI implementation, like you are just competing with an absolute wave of other senders, whether they're your direct competitors or not. It is really easy to get lost in a mailbox, especially around peak times, which I know can vary. But also there's economic headwinds. I mean, that I guess certainly there are challenges in terms of the economy and people's bank accounts that kind of go without saying can be a real challenge for revenue.
I feel like you're onto something with an episode of the Q4 outreach headwinds.
Oh, yeah.
So, one of my favorite parts about the podcast is getting to hear, examples of all this and success stories and wins that you've both seen in the industry. So, I'll start with you, Guy, and then Danielle, if you can add as well, because I'd love to hear both from both of you. But are there any quick wins that really move the needle towards increased email value with consuming a huge amount of time and effort? And some examples that you've seen uh, in the industry. And Guy, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a hot topic at the moment in the world of email marketing is all about accessibility. And on the one hand, it shouldn't be anything new. I mean, in the US, you've had the ADA laws for years now. More recently in Europe, where I work, we've got the European Accessibility Act, which is now being enforced. But it still feels like a lot of marketers, are paying lip service to accessibility, and they shouldn't. We see a lot of research which suggests that anything up to 40% of a typical consumer marketing audience suffers from some form of impairment, whether it's visual, whether it's hearing, whether it's physical, they struggle to engage with a keyboard, or, engaging with written content, challenges like dyslexia. And, there's a lot of guidance in terms of how you can prepare marketing content to accommodate those impairments. And why would you not want to? If you're not doing it and you're automatically ruling out, as much as 40% of your marketing audience from being able to engage and respond to your marketing messages, that just feels like a huge opportunity. Especially as a lot of the accessibility best practices are also, established email marketing best practices anyway, judicious use of white space, bulletproof buttons, that kind of stuff. So, all of your subscribers are going to benefit. So I feel that's an obvious one. What do you reckon, Danielle?
Yeah, I'm going to go with my first example for, of course, deliverability. Am I a broken record at this point? I don't know. But in our Invalidity's 2025 State of Email report that we published, the average overall global average inbox placement rate was about 85% for last year. And that may seem pretty decent. That's like an A on a report card, right? But that's 15% of your audience who is not seeing your messages. And as your list grows, or for senders that have bigger lists, that number, that percent means, even more. So making sure that even you have eyes on your deliverability, and then if you find an issue, correcting that is going to be huge to improve performance.
So another pet topic of mine, I mean, I talked about, being based in Europe, and I sometimes sort of talk about this as the GDPR effect, but it's basically something we've seen wherever new generation privacy laws have been implemented, whether it's CCPA in California or LGPD in Brazil. But just this idea that, a lot of the new legal requirements that are imposed on marketers are established best practices anyway, kind of like what we were just talking about with accessibility. So, you suddenly asking marketers to put more robust consent in place and provide more choice to their customers in terms of how their personal data is going to be used, and more transparency in terms of how you're going to communicate with them and what they're going to receive. And as I say, all of those are best practices anyway. So guess what? You're forced to make them happen. And your program performance improves and you make more money. So what's not to like? And I think as a recommendation, especially to email marketers where you're operating in a country or a territory where those new gen privacy laws haven't happened yet, there's no need to wait for them. It's almost learn from them, put those requirements in place now, partly because you're going to future-proof your program, but also because your customers really, really like those practices and they're going to be more engaged and you're going to make more money.
And Guy, I want to talk about in terms of like another quick win. I want to go back to something that you mentioned before, which is list churn. Like if you want quick wins, try to keep your list the same size, ideally. And one really easy way to do that, which the C-suite people may not love or C-level people may not love, is a snooze option. So allow your subscribers to opt down in terms of email frequency instead of just simply opting out. The goal is to really keep those subscribers engaged, make sure they stay on your list and keep them happy and deliver relevant content. So one way to do that, whether you're just finding they are not engaging very much or they haven't purchased anything in a certain amount of time, offer them a temporary snooze.
Absolutely. It's such an easy win. I think another one which I love is the idea of conversion optimization. I mean, we love talking about, the traditional funnel metrics, opens, clicks, etc. But what happens after that click? I think, if we're going to sort of take some rough numbers, email program generates 20% open rates and 10% of those openers click through. But on average, maybe 1 in every 25 of those clickers actually goes on to purchase. And what if you could convert that 1 in 25 to 2 in 25? You would double the performance of your email program by doing so. And a lot of those obstacles to conversion are relatively simple. It's sort of friction in the conversion process, like, the navigation's not that clear. Or, there's sort of confusing terms on the website, or it takes a load for pages to load, it takes a load of time for pages to load. And you could fix those and boost your conversion rates. And you know what? It's such an easy win. I was doing some maths before we had this conversation. And, improving your conversion rates by 0.1% is like the equivalent of improving your open rates by 20%. Why wouldn't you want to do it?
Oh, and I've got one more, just one more, I swear. If you, as an email program, have been sleeping on your triggered emails, don't. Triggered emails or automated messages like abandoned carts, abandoned browse. These messages generate a much higher revenue per email than your standard kind of batch promotional campaign. We had Greg Zakowicz from Omnisend on our Email After Hours podcast just a couple weeks ago. And he threw out that automated campaigns generate 37% of email sales while representing only 2% of the overall volume.
That's awesome.
Make the most of that volume. There you go.
Well, that's great. And hopefully you're taking notes listening to this, but that was a great list. So thank you for joining. I mean, accessibility, best practices, learning from GDPR, churn. That's a snooze option is incredible, and of course conversion optimization. All these things that you both mentioned are great points. And is there anything that excuse me, that senders should be focused on to protect their email revenue and sort of focus on, not, I guess, misleading customers or taking, taking overall control and autonomy of their email?
We have seen a couple of really interesting court cases, specifically in Washington State this year, where class action lawsuits have been brought against email programs specifically for using misleading subject lines. And, as an example, you get an email going, "Hey, Connor, you need to respond by midnight tonight or the sale's over." And then it goes on for another 3 days. And it's like, really? And we're starting to see class action lawsuits be brought against these. Washington State actually has its own legislation where the requirement to not use misleading subject lines is explicitly mandated in the act. And I believe there's anything up to sort of 12 other US states that have put similar legislation into place. And the fines are pretty significant. You're sort of talking $500 for each message carrying, a misleading subject line. So I think senders are going to have to start being very careful very quickly, because you know how the process works. There are people out there who are professional litigators who are going to pick up on this as the next big opportunity to make money. And there's always been like a fine line in the world of email marketing between puffery and actually overstepping the mark and telling a blatant untruth. So I think that's a big one. What do you think, Danielle? Any sort of misleading subject lines that really sort of stick in your throat?
I mean, I want to summarize what you were saying by like, don't get sued.
That's right.
I think that's a really great way to protect your email revenue. But I'm with you. A whole bunch of last chance, last chance, all of that. Like you see that all the time. But not only is that something that I think can have legal ramifications, but it also is going to like degrade the trust that your audience has in your brand and in your program. And how do you put a dollar figure on mistrust? That's really difficult.
That's right. And the mailbox providers hate it too.
Yeah. Also, Gmail hates it.
Of course they do. Before we close out, and I think I want to end on one great question, but specifically for our marketing audience that listens to this podcast, what do we need to know about email after hours? I'd love to get a little synopsis of your amazing podcast.
It kind of felt when you introduced us and you were giving us the sort of briefing today's podcast, like you were talking about ours. I think hopefully the clue is in the name. We like to have a bit of fun. We crack a few jokes, and some of them are even a little off color. But we do like to bring great guests to come and join us, have good email conversations, and there's our listeners can learn from. And going great guns. We started 2.5 years ago. We are up to 60 something episodes now, getting good numbers on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. So any of the listeners who would like another dose of myself and Danielle, that's where you can find us. What have I missed?
Come nerd out with us. It's all things email nerd on email after hours. Please, come over and have a listen.
Yes. And from one podcast to another, it's awesome to have some amazing leaders and experts in this space to join the Millennium Live podcast. And can't thank you both enough, Danielle and Guy, about coming on and talking about ROI in email marketing and why email marketing is so effective and continues to be. And as tools like AI come around and tactics to maximize revenue, and really communicate that value to the C-level. I think that's one of the most important key aspects here that we discussed today. So thank you again. Thank you to our audience. I hope you enjoy the Transformational CMO Assembly coming up, and hope that we get to do another podcast, because it's always fun to do this with those who also do it and enjoy talking all about marketing. So love to do this again. Thank you both for joining.
Great conversation. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.